The evening was quiet when he called me. His voice was calm, polite, and familiar in a way that made me pause. My father's friend had always been kind to me, sometimes too kind. He spoke with a tone that felt both casual and deliberate, asking if I'd like to come by his house that night. I didn't know what made me say yes. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strange comfort I felt whenever he looked at me, as if he could see something I hadn't yet understood about myself. When I arrived, the house seemed different than I remembered. It wasn't large, but it carried a warmth that felt personal. Soft light glowed from the lamps, and faint music played somewhere in the background. He greeted me at the door, dressed neatly as always, smiling in that quiet way that didn't quite reach his eyes. For a moment, I thought of my father and wondered if he'd ever imagine me standing here, being welcomed into a space that felt too private to belong to anyone but family. He asked if I wanted tea, and I nodded. As he moved around the kitchen, I noticed how still the house was, how even the ticking of the clock seemed slower. I sat on the couch, running my fingers across the fabric, listening to the sound of cups clinking and the water boiling. He returned, placing a cup in front of me, then sat across, his gaze resting softly on my face. We talked at first about simple things, work, family, nothing that mattered. But with each minute, the silence between our words grew longer, heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. He asked about my life, about things my father never asked. He laughed at my small jokes, but his eyes didn't leave me. I caught myself looking back, unsure what I was searching for. He stood up to adjust the curtains, and I noticed the way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt. When he turned back, he smiled as if he had caught my glance. "You've grown up," he said softly. The words hung in the air longer than they should have. I laughed it off, but my throat was dry. He sat back down, closer this time, the space between us thinner than before. He began telling stories from the past, about my father, about the days when life was simpler. His tone softened as he spoke, his eyes drifting from the memory of friendship to something more reflective. "Your father was always strong," he said, "but you think too much." I smiled awkwardly, unsure what to say, but he continued, "That's not bad. It just means you feel things deeply." I didn't know why, but my chest tightened. Maybe because I'd never heard anyone say that before. Maybe because it was true. I wanted to look away, but something in me stayed still. He leaned back, took a sip of his tea, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. The air was warm, and yet I felt cold inside. When he got up again, he dimmed the light and turned off the music. "It's getting late," he said quietly, "you can stay here if you'd like. There's a spare room." His tone was gentle, almost careful, as though he didn't want to frighten me. I nodded, unable to find my voice. He showed me the room, a small, neat space with a bed already made. As I stood in the doorway, he said goodnight and smiled again, that same soft, unreadable smile. I murmured a thank you and watched him walk away, his shadow stretching down the hall. When the door closed, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the faint light slipping through the curtains. My heart was restless. I could still hear his footsteps, still feel the warmth of his voice echoing in the quiet house. There was something unspoken between us, something I didn't yet understand but could feel pressing against the silence. I lay down, trying to sleep, but all I could think about was the way he'd looked at me, as if he knew exactly what I was afraid to admit. The night felt longer than usual. I could hear the faint sound of the ceiling fan spinning above me, slow and steady, like a heartbeat. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face again, the calm in his expression, the warmth in his eyes, the quiet understanding that lingered between us. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but something about that house made it impossible to escape my own thoughts. After what felt like hours, I heard light footsteps outside the door. Then, a soft knock. I froze. Before I could answer, the door opened slightly, and he stood there, half in shadow, wearing a simple t-shirt. "I thought you might still be awake," he said gently. His voice was low, careful, like he didn't want to disturb something fragile in the air. I sat up, unsure what to say. He stepped inside slowly, holding 2 glasses of water. "You didn't drink much earlier," he said with a small smile. I took one, and our fingers brushed for a second. It was nothing and everything at once. That brief touch sent a quiet tremor through me that I couldn't explain. That he sat down on the chair near the bed, the kind of distance that pretends to be safe. For a moment, we said nothing. The air between us was thick with unspoken things. Then he asked, "Do you ever feel like you can't tell anyone what's really going on inside you?" The question cut through me. I didn't answer right away. "Sometimes," I said finally. "Sometimes it feels easier to stay quiet." He nodded, looking at the floor. "That's how I've felt most of my life," he said. There was a weight in his voice, a sadness I hadn't noticed before. "You spend years trying to be what everyone expects, and somewhere along the way, you forget who you are." I watched him as he spoke. His words felt close to something I'd never dared to admit, not even to myself. For the first time, I didn't feel like he was just my father's friend. He felt like someone who saw through me, someone who understood the silent things I carried. That he looked up at me then, and our eyes met. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of questions, fear, and something else we didn't dare name. He stood slowly, walked toward the window, and looked out into the dark street. "It's strange," he said softly, "how the night makes people honest." I didn't move. My throat felt tight. He turned back to me, and there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. Then he came closer, just enough for me to feel his presence. "You remind me of myself when I was your age," he said quietly. His voice was warm, but trembling beneath control. I could feel his hesitation, his conflict. There was a kind of electricity in that space between us, gentle but undeniable. I could hear my own heartbeat, too loud in the still room. He reached out, as if to adjust the blanket on my shoulder, but his hand lingered a moment too long. Our eyes met again, and the world seemed to slow down. Neither of us spoke. The distance between us vanished in that silence, replaced by something heavy, human, and real. He sat beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his arm. I didn't pull away. I didn't know if I should. My mind was full of noise, but my body stayed still, listening to the rhythm of the moment. There was no rush, no clear beginning, only a gradual surrender to whatever had been growing between us for so long. He whispered my name, so softly that it barely reached me. It wasn't a question or a command, it was a confession. In that fragile moment, I could feel everything he wasn't saying, the guilt, the longing, the fear of what would happen if the world ever knew. The room felt weightless. The walls seemed to disappear. All that remained was the sound of breathing, mine, his, and the truth neither of us could hide from anymore. What happened next wasn't loud or sudden. It was quiet, hesitant, almost tender, like the world itself was holding its breath. Nothing about it felt right, but nothing about it felt false either. It was something in between, where loneliness and need found a place to meet, just for one night, under the dim light and the safety of silence.
The next morning, I woke up to a strange silence in the house. My sister wasn't in her room, and the kitchen was empty. When I went downstairs, I found her sitting in the living room, her face pale and her eyes swollen. She didn't greet me the way she usually did. Instead, she looked at me for a moment and then turned away. Something felt wrong. I sat beside her and asked what had happened. She didn't answer immediately. After a long pause, she said, "I know you've been spending a lot of time with Abba." Her voice trembled slightly. "People in this house have started talking." I was shocked. For a few seconds, I couldn't even speak. I told her that nothing inappropriate had happened, that we were only sorting old photographs and talking about memories. But she didn't look convinced. She stood up and said, "Ariba, I don't know what your intentions are, but this doesn't look right. You don't understand how people think." Her words cut deep. I felt hurt that my own sister could doubt me. I tried to explain that Mr. Rahman had only shared his memories, and that all I had done was listen with respect. But the more I spoke, the less she seemed to believe me. Later that day, I went to my room and stayed there quietly. I could hear voices from the hallway, my sister's, her husband's, and then Mr. Rahman's. The tone was calm but heavy, like everyone was trying not to let the conversation turn into a fight. After a while, there was silence again. In the evening, Mr. Rahman came to my door and gently knocked. I didn't open it right away, but he said softly, "Ariba, I'm sorry if my actions have caused any discomfort between you and your sister." His voice carried genuine sadness. I opened the door, and he stood there, looking older than before. He said, "I never meant to create misunderstanding. I only found peace in remembering my past through your kindness. You reminded me of my daughter. She used to listen to me the same way." His words filled my eyes with tears. For a moment, I felt how much pain he had been hiding behind his calmness. I told him that I understood and that he didn't need to apologize. But he shook his head and said, "Sometimes, even when we mean well, the world chooses to see it differently. That's the nature of life." His words stayed with me long after he left. That night, my sister came into my room. She looked tired and guilty. She sat beside me and said, "Maybe I overreacted, but you don't understand how it feels to see my father-in-law talk so openly with someone else. I thought you were replacing me." I was surprised by her confession. I realized that her jealousy wasn't about mistrust, it came from insecurity, from the distance she felt in her own home. I held her hand and said, "You haven't lost anyone, Sana. You just stopped seeing the love that's still around you." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she hugged me. The air between us softened, but the pain still lingered. When we came downstairs later, Mr. Rahman was sitting quietly, reading a book. He looked up, smiled faintly, and asked if everything was fine. My sister nodded but didn't say much. There was peace in the silence, though it felt fragile, like a wound slowly beginning to heal. That night, I sat on the balcony again, staring at the stars. I thought about everything that had happened, the misunderstandings, the hurt, the loneliness. I realized how quickly people can twist something pure into something doubtful. Sometimes love is not about romance or attraction, it's about the quiet understanding that connects two lonely hearts. Before sleeping, I whispered to myself, maybe betrayal doesn't always come from actions. Sometimes it comes from how easily we stop believing in each other. The thought stayed with me until morning, like a quiet ache that refused to fade. The next morning, the house felt calm again, as if the storm from the day before had finally passed. My sister was kinder, quieter, and more thoughtful than usual. When I came down for breakfast, she had already set the table. She smiled faintly and said, "Let's not hold on to things that hurt." Her words were simple, but I could feel the sincerity in them. I nodded, grateful that the tension between us had started to fade. Mr. Rahman entered the room a few minutes later. He greeted us politely, the same calmness in his voice as always. But I could sense something different about him. He looked peaceful, but there was also a kind of distance in his eyes, as if he had already made a decision in his heart. After breakfast, he asked me to come to the study once more. When I entered, the room was filled with the soft light of morning. On the table lay a single envelope with my name on it. He said, "I wanted to give this to you before you leave. It's just a letter." His voice was steady but emotional. I hesitated, not knowing what to say. He smiled and continued, "You've reminded me of things I thought I'd forgotten, the value of kindness, the comfort of being heard. Don't let this world take that away from you." I thanked him, not realizing how much those words would stay with me. Before I could say more, he excused himself and left the room. I opened the envelope and found a handwritten letter inside. In it, he wrote about how loneliness can sometimes make people look for meaning in unexpected places, and how my kindness had brought warmth back into his life. He ended the letter by saying, "Never let anyone make you doubt your intentions. True hearts are often misunderstood." Reading those words made my eyes well up. I folded the letter carefully and kept it in my bag, knowing it would always remind me that goodness doesn't need to be explained, it only needs to be felt. Later that day, I told my sister that I was leaving. She hugged me tightly, apologizing for her words and thanking me for coming. "Maybe I needed you to remind me what really matters," she said. I smiled and told her to take care of herself and her home. When I went to say goodbye to Mr. Rahman, he simply raised his hand in blessing and said, "May peace follow you wherever you go." As I sat in the car on my way back home, I kept thinking about everything that had happened. The house, once filled with silence and distance, had taught me something valuable, that not every story of love has to be romantic. Sometimes, love is found in understanding, forgiveness, and compassion. Days passed, and life slowly returned to normal. But sometimes, when I looked at the letter, I remembered the feeling of that quiet house, the heaviness in its walls, and the people trying to heal behind them. I realized that betrayal doesn't always mean breaking promises, sometimes it means breaking trust, even unintentionally. And love isn't always about closeness, sometimes it's about giving someone the strength to move on. Of the story that began with confusion ended with understanding. I had gone to my sister's house thinking I would bring her comfort, but instead, I learned how fragile relationships can be and how easily emotions can be misunderstood. As I looked out the window, the sunlight falling softly on my face, I whispered to myself, some stories don't end with love or loss, they end with lessons. And with that thought, I closed my eyes, thankful that even in the midst of misunderstanding, kindness had found its place.